But because of what's happening, I think it makes sense to start from the 7th of October. I have condemned unequivocally and without qualifications what Hamas has done. Hamas has killed civilians, has taken civilian hostages, and this is against international law. It qualifies at least as war crimes, and this is critical to understand, because especially at this moment we have to be able to condemn all violations of international law that take place, regardless of who commits them, and regardless of, not regardless, but taking into account all the humanity that is affected. And so, as said, there is, as a people oppressed, as a people under illegal occupation, the Palestinians have a right to resist under international law. Of course, we are not in the decolonization era. We are in the post-9/11 era. So there is even when you were saying that the challenges of access that my mandate has, I experience all sorts of challenges, because even speaking reason, common sense, like saying yes, people under oppression have the right to resist. Nonetheless, there are limits, and these limits are stringent, and the rights to life should always be protected. So there is no question that Hamas is responsible for crimes, war crimes, and this goes without saying. At the same time, the response that Israel has given doesn't meet international standard either. And I cannot find one provision of international humanitarian law that has not been violated by Israel as the occupying power, and who's acting in the name of self-defense. Because even self-defense has limits. And there are two layers here that we need to examine. The first is, what is the objective of the response that Israel has chosen? The response, and it has been articulated in different ways, but it's to eradicate Hamas, to uproot and basically crush Hamas militarily and politically. Let's assume that this is a legitimate aim in international law. And again, for me, it's very opaque. The opaqueness has implications in terms of what is acceptable and what can be considered a legitimate response in international law. But what we have seen happening is the killing of thousands of civilians, the use of, just in 1 week, and I do not have updated figures, but in 1 week, 6,000 bombs have been launched over a piece of land that is the most crowded on Earth, 360 square kilometers, in which 2.2 million people live, half of whom are children. 3,300 Palestinians have already been killed. Over 1,000 of them are children. And this has happened amidst the bombing of essential civilian infrastructure, hospitals, ambulances, schools, mosques, houses. I think the last update I saw was that 80,000 housing units had been destroyed or severely damaged. What kind of proportional response is it? How does it, again, and then each military action, not the operation in its entirety, but each bombing needs to respond to certain criteria in terms of international law. It is to be proportionate, it is to distinguish between civilian and military, and it is to be respectful of the principle of precaution. So if there is a risk to harm civilians, well, the operation is to be withheld. So you see the layer of double illegality that is already evident. But on top of it, there is another element, and again, I want to stress it, particularly in the US, because I've heard people legitimizing the blockade, like if the blockade had started on the 7th of September. No, there has been already a 16-year unlawful blockade, naval, air, and ground blockade over Gaza. It was already a humanitarian crisis before the 7th of October. The population was already on the brink of collapse because for example, just to give you a few indicators, but there is no access to drinking water for the entire Palestinian population in Gaza. 5% of the available water is considered fit for drinking. And in fact, the waterborne disease is very high in Gaza. There is 7 out of 10 people depend on humanitarian aid. And of course, I mean, the blockade had already been called, and there is a wall-to-wall consensus that it's unlawful because it constitutes a collective punishment. On top of it, there have been 5 major wars between Israel and Hamas, as if it was, let's say it's a war between a non-armed group, non-state actors, an armed group, and the state. So there have been 5 wars, which already before the 7th of October had killed 4,200 Palestinians, including 1,200 children. So this is the situation. It was already a humanitarian catastrophe where someone who's 16-year-old has gone through 5 major wars. And if someone carries a trauma forever, having gone through 1 war, imagine what it is for someone who's an adolescent having gone through 5 major events like this. So, and on top of this situation, Israel has tightened the blockade by not allowing entry of water, food, and electricity. Another layer of illegality, because it might be intentional starvation, so the blockade is a war crime, and if the blockade leads to intentional starvation, it's a crime against humanity. So it's another level of seriousness. Sorry, I know that it was a long response,
but
I really wanted to give the full picture.
Yes, I understand. These are not...
Russia, Ukraine, there was no need to have a pronouncement, an advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice. It was clear that a war of aggression is unlawful, that occupation is a violation of the right of self-determination of the people, and so it's unlawful. And it should be met, rightly so, with the responses that are afforded under the UN Charter, so political, diplomatic, and economic measures.
In terms of the crimes that are being committed compared to what we have seen before.
Yes, I think that it's more. I agree with you. There is no restraint. There is a heightened level of violence, verbal, that reflects also policies on the ground. I've also heard statements like there are no civilians in Gaza. What are you talking about? Like considering all civilians, including children, including young children, as part of this political endeavor. And this is critical. I mean, we need to dissect in these tragic hours what's happening, because there are a number of authoritative scholars who have come out already saying and warning about the risk of genocide. Genocidal statements have been issued throughout the year, and I noted them because I was seriously alarmed by, again, this heightened level of verbal violence, dehumanizing violence, because we have seen it elsewhere. We know where it leads. And there is already a serious dehumanization of Palestinians in Israel. And there is a wonderful author, Nurit Peled, who has studied how Palestinians are dehumanized in Israeli textbooks and in Israeli society. And she argues that this is a critical element that allows this disconnect when an Israeli adolescent, an Israeli 18-year-old wears the uniform and goes to the West Bank or to the Gaza border, he or she doesn't necessarily see children, doesn't necessarily see human beings, because they're raised the thinking that the Palestinians are the enemy, that the Palestinians want to kill them all, exterminate them all. And there is one thing that we cannot take away from the equation. I do think that we also need to recognize that this is not something that is limited to Israelis. The entire Jewish people have been suffering persecution for centuries, and there is a fear that it's almost built into the DNA, and this doesn't justify anything of what's happening, but we need to take it into account, because those who are not, those who do not have their flesh and blood into this situation have to be able to advise on the ground of wisdom and being even-handed, and not to further incentivize or justify this kind of language. So I was saying, a number of authors and scholars have denounced the possibility that this amounts to genocide. What is genocide? Genocide is a particularly serious atrocity crime because it requires a specific intent. Is the intent to destroy in full or in part a population on ethnic, religious, or national grounds. And it's not something that happens with one act only. And there is a series of acts that can happen disjunctively. So they are in a way mutually exclusive. You can have one and not the other. But some elements that have been already found in what's happening is the killing of mass killing of members of a given group, the causing serious bodily or mental harm, psychological harm to the group, or deliberately inflicting conditions of life calculated to bring about physical destruction of the people in full or in part. And let's say that the situation of Gaza, 16-year-old unlawful blockade with 6 major wars, and probably there were now probably 7,000 people killed in this time. I mean, I think it's really meaningful to look at this from the Genocide Convention perspective. Why it's important? Because there is not just an obligation to ensure accountability in a way. It's not just about bringing people to justice, to an international court, to an international tribunal once the atrocity crime has been committed. It's also, there is an obligation in the convention on the Genocide Convention, and there is an obligation to prevent, to act to prevent the commission of such a crime. And this is all the more urgent now.